Welcome back to part 2 of the Thursday edition of The Attitude with Arnie Arneson and producers Dave Scott and Stephanie Collins. But what we also know is that Thursdays is our monthly race class with Jonathan Feingold. Legislation restricting the teaching of race and racism in public schools and government entities has spread across the country. In an effort to respond, we grabbed Boston University law professor Jonathan Feingold 3 years ago, everyone. And he has joined me, Arnie Arneson, and The Attitude. And we offer a class called Race Class. It's a once-a-month course conversation where listeners can hear what it's like to approach race and racism from a place of curiosity and history, rather than fear and anxiety. I think we're up to Race Class 33 or 34, some incredible number. But Jonathan, thank you so much for spending the time, bringing us interesting people to interview as well, which I think is important, but also to give us a lens on conversations we have where we don't automatically sort of understand the nature of racism in the course of the conversation, or we don't understand what it is that we're looking at, because there's another way of looking at these issues, whether it's environmental issues, whether it's economic issues, whether it's healthcare issues. And if we don't look at them through other lenses, we may not only fix the problem, but we're not going to also understand what is the driver of many of these problems. And when we were talking about what we should be talking about this week, I thought, well, we had an interesting conversation about the climate crisis, and a young woman from Brown suddenly started talking to us about the impact of the climate crisis on people of color, on people that live in poverty areas. And the idea is they've been living in a climate crisis long before us, because we made sure that all those toxic industries were in their backyard so they couldn't breathe. We made sure they didn't have the infrastructure, so they didn't have the clean water that they needed. We made sure that everything around their lives really impacted their ability to sort of survive, or it undermined their survivability. So as we're suddenly shocked by what's happening with the environmental degradation caused by the climate crisis, we should have been talking to them 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago, because they've been intimate with it, and we, to a large extent, have ignored it. So I saw an article at the Brookings Institute, and the article was, "Banning critical race theory could hinder the pursuit of environmental justice." And the idea that they wove those two things together, for me, was not only fascinating, but it screamed, you got to call Jonathan Feingold. So thank you for joining us again, and thank you for bringing sort of new insight into topics that we need to be both aware of and have discussions about.
Thanks, Arnie. As always, nice to be here with you. And you raise a really good point, just as a point of departure, that whether you refer to it climate crises or pollution crises, toxic waste crises, none of that's new. But what we are seeing now is that more and more Americans who generally live in whiter and more affluent communities are increasingly affected by these crises, particularly extreme natural disasters that appear quite obviously to be propelled by warming planet that is human caused. And so just a worthwhile observation that for a long time, we might ask, like, who we're imagining when we say we haven't been particularly concerned about the harm that industry causes. But we're concerned now because we and the communities that we see ourselves in are now at risk, which is just sort of a side observation. And this is going to be a conversation about Project 2025. I don't know if you knew that, but it's,
I didn't know that, but I'll follow you anywhere.
Yeah. So the first question, I'm not going to ask us to answer it, but I just want to put on the table is, what is racism? How do you prevent it and remedy it? Just, what is it? So anyone who's listening, just think to yourself, what is it? how might you prevent it or remedy it? And if you're thinking about sort of environmental justice and, the um, scenario that Arnie, you laid out, how do we think about that term? And, but well, it's going to be a long wind up, 25-minute wind up, and then we'll get to the punch.
Okay.
First, real question for you, Arnie. Should chemical manufacturing plants be located next to schools?
Of course not.
Okay, of course not. I think that's, um, you know, of course not. If they are, because some are, who do you think the kids are that are at that school? You think they're wealthy white kids? You think they're poor white kids, poor kids of color, immigrant communities? Or I guess I'll just put it this way. Who is not next to the chemical manufacturing plant?
Exactly. Wealthy, probably people who are white, probably people who basically can ensure that zoning and planning and politicians basically respond to them so that they are sort of insulated from those kinds of questions and concerns. But people that don't have that kind of power, that don't have that kind of money and influence, then guess what? They get stuck with those things.
Yeah, so part of this is about power. It's about who we as a society uh, prioritize and value, who we're comfortable to quote unquote sacrifice for industry, for profit. So another question. Have you, Arnie, heard of Cancer Alley?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. In
And
fact,
so,
there was a point in time in New Hampshire where we were suspicious that there was a version of Cancer Alley here, but Governor Sununu, in this case, John Sununu, made sure that any kind of study of that was eliminated so we couldn't look into the connection between industry and cancer in my state.
so Cancer Alley refers to an 85-mile long corridor in Louisiana
Yeah.
between Baton Rouge and New Orleans that has over 150 industrial polluting facilities that have contributed to all sorts of environmental harms, health hazards that disproportionately affect communities of color, in particular, some Black communities. One of the sort of areas located within Cancer Alley is St. John's Parish. Within St. John's Parish is the Fifth Ward Elementary School, and it's located 3 blocks from a petrochemical plant, uh, formerly owned by DuPont, now Denka, which I believe is a Japanese-owned company. St. John's Parish, this area within Cancer Alley, has the highest cancer risk in the nation driven by air pollution, due, according to the EPA, largely from toxic air pollutants emitted by nearby facilities. The closer you live to the facility, the more dangerous. According to a relatively recent EPA report, 85% of the cancer risk is attributable to Denka's operations, to the chemical plant's operations. Now, St. John the Baptist Parish, overall, it's around 58% Black. And so you might say, oh, well, it's not as concentrated as I imagined, sort of the vulnerability to this harm. But it turns out that 94% of the population within a 1 mile radius of Denka is Black.
Oh, God.
And in a 2014 EPA study, found that residents in the census tract located next to Denka face a cancer risk 47 times the national average. A more recent study was at 7 times the national average, still high, and 91% of residents in that tract are Black. So the question is, how does this happen?
Yeah, exactly.
And I mean that not just rhetorically, but as a matter of state governance, federal governance? Like, how does this happen? How is it that you're able to get chemical plant permitted to operate next to a school and to just accept that when you have overwhelming data of the harm? And what parent would need an EPA commission study to be terrified by the prospect of having their kid go to school next to a chemical plant?
And Jonathan, you're talking about how could they have placed it there? Why would they have placed it there? But let's fast forward to what you're describing now with the level of cancer. And not only do we know that there's a connection between the location of that facility, the people that live there, their result that they basically have a shorter lifespan, will develop some kind of acute illness. So I guess here's my question, and maybe you can answer it, but now we know in Cancer Alley and in this particular region that you're talking about, what have we done when we have all this data in front of us? Like, what have we done for the people that live there? Do they have universal health care in those communities because of it? Have we offered to relocate them? Have we sued the company? I mean, it's like, it's one thing that we made the horrific mistake, or maybe intentional, to have placed it there. But given the decades and given what we see as a result, what's our obligation to what we did, which was to create this incredible toxic failure?
And so the we is interesting. What do we do? What do we do? So first, the community who lives there, who has to deal with this, they have been organizing in order to try to change the status quo where they live. Various local community groups over time, and individuals, like, they are fighting.
Yeah.
But the we, so like, who is the we? Part of the we is the Louisiana state government,
Right.
who ostensibly has an obligation to protect the health of its residents, and that obligation resides in actual entities like the Louisiana Department of Health
Right.
and the Louisiana Department of Environmental Quality. Now, neither of those state agencies, and anyone who knows anything about Louisiana and how there have been active efforts to protect the petrochemical industry, even when it's not all that economically viable, and certainly is a detriment to the health of folks who live in Louisiana, they have not intervened in any meaningful way, and including the Department of Health not recommending to relocate the school. One of the reasons was because it would actually be hard to find a different place in the general area that would be safe. But so you've got Louisiana agencies. You've also got the federal government, the Department of Justice, the EPA, who for a long time did nothing. And so if you're in a law class, and among other questions, including how you might actually build power locally in a community when the deck is way stacked against that community, you're going to try to understand what legal levers you might be able to pull. And so one question is, so there's all this evidence now. It is pretty much undisputed that as a function of Louisiana agencies, either action or inaction, you have industry that gets to be located and pollute in overwhelmingly Black neighborhoods that lead to overwhelming health catastrophe. So, like, the record's there.
Right.
And so the question is, is there a law that prohibits this? And there's this coalition called the Title VI Alliance, and working with local community, local organizations, uh, their response is, well, there actually is law in the book that prohibits this. Title VI.
Okay.
Title VI is one of the statutes that was passed as part of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And it prohibits generally, though I'm sort of summarizing or paraphrasing, racial discrimination by entities that receive federal financial assistance. So it touches a lot of different entities, including sort of state agencies, especially if they're receiving federal grants or administering federal grants, higher education, federal student loans they're getting. But the question is, okay, so if Title VI is relevant here, could members in this community bring a lawsuit by themselves and claim that my state is discriminating against me and my community on the basis of race?
Abandon us.
So the answer to that question is that it would be hard to do so.
Why?
Even though it's like, why?
Why?
Why? Well, because the Supreme Court has held, this is now, a couple decades ago, that Title VI, that the statutory language only prohibits intentional discrimination, meaning that you only have a viable claim if you can show that this Louisiana agency permitted this toxic polluting facility because
they were black.
It wanted to harm the black community. And there might actually be some evidence there. I don't know. But that's very difficult to prove as an evidentiary matter. But there is a but. There remain agency regulations or implementing regulations that agencies like the EPA, like the Department of Justice, like the Department of Education have promulgated as part of their duty to effectuate Title VI. And within those regulations are a disparate impact provision, which says that even absent evidence of intent, if a covered entity is engaging in conduct that has the effect of disproportionately harming a group on the basis of race, then that also violates Title VI. Now, a private individual can't bring a lawsuit, but a private individual can submit a complaint to the Department of Education or to EPA or DOJ, and then those agencies, through as a entity within the federal government, can enforce Title VI and potentially bring a lawsuit on the grounds of disparate impact. And so to pause, this is a moment where we're encountering two sort of different theories of what we might think of as discrimination or racial harm. One is the harm is based on intentionally treating two groups differently, one group better than the other. Mm-hmm. Another is, well, whatever one's intent, taking action that is disparately harming one group and benefiting another. Where the main difference is that there's not some conscious intent to cause that harm. And you might say, you might say, John, all of that talk about disparate impact sounds wokey to me. Was this some new sort of lefty thing that came out of the Biden administration? And if you were to ask that question, I would say, well, no, Arnie. When Title VI was passed as part of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, there was a commission put into place to think through what the regulations should entail. And 2 years later, in 1966, the disparate impact regulation became standard operating procedure for all of these agencies. And so it's been since the mid-60s. So this is not new. So now, who, Arnie, doesn't like disparate impact regulations and disparate impact conceptions of discrimination?
Other than the Heritage Foundation?
No, don't go other than. You can start there.
We'll start
Because
there. No, we'll
in
start there.
Project 2025,
Right, exactly.
one of the explicit recommendations to the next administration is to eliminate disparate impact regulations from the agencies,
Yeah, yeah.
to strip it. And so who is
But haven't they
giving
been helped?
off?
Wait, Jonathan, wait a minute. But haven't they been helped with the decision about Chevron?
Well, they have been, but it didn't even take
It
that.
didn't even happen. It happened before that decision. They were already preparing on stripping it, is what you're saying.
Well, it's all connects.
It all connects.
So Louisiana. So in 2022, based on complaints that were filed by local community organizations that were documenting in detail the severe disparate impact that the placement of toxic industry in Louisiana is having on Black communities, um, the EPA finally started to act. And what happened next? Louisiana sues the EPA and the Department of Justice, arguing that the EPA and DOJ's desire to enforce the disparate impact regulations is unlawful. Why? Like, what is the theory? The theory is that those regulations constitute racial discrimination because they require the agency to consider race when making decisions.
God. Oh my God.
And so you
So,
might,
so in other words, that you could never do disparate impact because if you're going to be looking at the impact and it turns out that it's an impact on people of color, then you can't look at the impact because you are now being racist and you're using race as the component of how you define it.
yeah. And so it sounds like, Arnie, you have read the decision from the Louisiana district judge that earlier this year agreed with Louisiana. That judge, Louisiana district judge, enjoined the EPA and DOJ from enforcing their disparate impact regulations. And you might ask, well, what was the judge's rationale?
Yeah, I'd love to know.
It includes this statement. And so as part of the analysis, in issuing a preliminary injunction, so this is forcing an entity to stop engaging in particular conduct before you've actually had before litigation is concluded. You have to balance a number of interests, including the quote unquote public interest. And here the court states, the public interest here is that governmental agencies abide by its laws and treat all of its citizens equally without considering race. To be sure, if a decision maker has to consider race, which disparate impact
By definition.
does,
Yeah.
to decide it has indeed participated in racism. Pollution does not discriminate, nor should the state. That last part I just added on. The nor should the state was me. But so remember, I open with what is racism?
Wow.
And here you have a relatively recently appointed district judge who was appointed by Trump. That doesn't always determine how things go, as we've talked about here. But one of the animating theories in the opinion is that the legal theory that could actually protect communities of color from having to live next to like industrial waste is racist because it would require the state to think about race.
Could I ask a question? Could they have used class and wealth instead? So as a workaround, Not only are we talking about the fact that, if you look at the impact, and it's a predominantly black community that's being impacted, they're also probably not very wealthy, okay? And that they're poor. And therefore, wealth is more generic as opposed to race. Could the argument have been that the placement of this facility was, in fact, it did have a disparate impact? It had a disparate impact on people of poverty. And therefore, because of that, they created this vulnerability. And therefore, you don't have to get to the issue of race, because what you've got to is the issue of income.
So, the short answer is no, in part because class is generally not understood as a protected category. And so, but I don't think we should always presume that communities of color or white communities, respectively, are concentrated racially because of class. Oftentimes, class is relevant, but it's also a history of either both private and public forms of discrimination that prohibit even sort of more affluent, that lead to sort of poorer whites living among more affluent whites, and more affluent people of color not actually being able to access homes in predominantly white communities, whether through racial covenants, through racial steering, or other things.
All right, I need to let you go.
I see we're out of time.
We began this conversation. This is our monthly race class with Jonathan Feingold from BU Law School. And the rationale for this conversation was the following story that came out of Brookings. Banning critical race theory could hinder the pursuit of environmental justice. And now we're sort of revealing about systemic racism and the inability to even not only recognize it, but to address the consequences of it. Thank you, Professor Feingold, for doing this. You definitely ran with it, and we need more time on this conversation, so we'll do this again.
All right, thanks, Arnie.